Yeah, hi everyone, I'm Tracy. Thank you so much for having me. I'm going to be throwing a lot of information at you. So that's my Twitter username, not Lime Darling. And I'll be tweeting out some of the links and resources that I reference in this talk because we only have 20 minutes and a lot of information to go over. So a little bit about me. My journey, my real relevant journey kind of started about 7 years ago. I'm a designer. I have a background in design with an art degree and didn't know how to code, but I had this idea for a website I wanted to build. And long story short, I taught myself how to program Python and Django. I launched Sweating Lovely, and for the last 7 years, up until a couple months ago, it was my full-time job. And as I learned how to program and as I built this site up, did all the design and development for the site, I looked at the state of programming tutorials, and as I learned more, kind of was like, why was it taught that way when it really should be taught this way? And I waited for new blog posts and tutorials to come out in this way that I thought should be taught, and it never came out, so I ended up writing that tutorial myself. So this is Hello Web App, is the book series that I wrote about 1.5 years ago, and it teaches basically programming for designers, and it's been a really wonderful project to work on, and I really wanted to help more designers take the path that I did and learn programming. And as I've been working on this book series, and working with teaching programming for designers, I thought a lot also about how can I teach design to programmers? Because I'm really enthusiastic about helping more people become more disciplinary, or help more people essentially, learn a little bit about the other side. Now, when I say design, I don't mean all of this. Design is incredibly complicated. So UX design and UI design and visual design, and not becoming a designer per se, but I really want to help people just learn how to do enough design that they can feel more comfortable creating better interfaces or creating websites or creating interfaces. Because as a programmer, there's going to be times when you want to launch your open source project or whatever app that you're building, and I want to help you, and instead of going to trying to find a designer, help you start building those sites yourself as a programmer. Now, when I talk design, I don't mean something like this. This is my biggest pet peeve in beginner design talks when someone goes over the golden ratio. Do not think it has anything to do with beginner design. And I'm not going to talk about the pieces and parts of typography because that is ridiculous. And for some reason, again, all these beginner design books always start talking about the parts of typography. I want to just help you create better, more effective designs. It's like the first step into doing design yourself. So first and foremost, the main thing to remember to help you become a better visual designer, do better visuals, is to cut down on clutter. Now, when I mean clutter, I mean sites like this, which, they're better now, but this is like the epitome of the cluttery website. The fastest way to better design is to simply cut down on clutter. So to illustrate this point, here's this little widget I created. And we're going to go over some basic principles about design and apply them to this widget and make it look better. So first, the grid. Now, you've probably all heard about the grid. A grid is essentially just lining things up. Because when things are misaligned, even like a couple pixels or so, that's a sign, that adds a little bit of clutter to your design. There's always that story about the designer who works with the developer. The designer gives the developer a mock-up, and then the developer implements that mock-up. But the designer comes back and is like, hey, that's 5 pixels to the left. It's supposed to be lined up. And the developer says, 5 pixels, does that matter? It does matter, because that's a little bit of clutter, a little bit of misalignment in the website. So, I love Bootstrap. I think Bootstrap is a great resource. Bootstrap comes with a grid, and it just gives you an easy platform in order to add a grid to whatever you're designing. So back to this little widget. If we just normalize the vertical lines in this widget, lining everything up, it's already looking a little bit less cluttery and a little bit better. So next up, color. So the big high-level color principles, like keeping your colors complementary, I'll get into that in a second. But really a good rule of thumb is to use mostly neutrals and then one brighter color for important bits. Now, color is like this huge topic, and there's like so much I can say about this. I personally took an entire quarter on color theory in art school. That's ridiculous, but there's a lot of good resources if you want to learn more about color, like this Smashing Magazine article, which I'll be tweeting out later. But I want to go into a shortcut, and this is the shortcut I use for every design I do, even as a professional designer, for my books, for my websites. Anytime I have to do a color palette, I go to colorlovers.com, which people can submit color palettes, and you can go on Color Lovers and sort by like most loved color palettes of all time, get all these wonderful color palettes, and then you can just go ahead and experiment with them, and it's pretty much guaranteed that these colors are going to be complementary to each other. So if you take that little widget and you just start grabbing some color palettes and applying it and seeing what works, and sometimes they don't work. You can try different combinations, start working through some color combinations using these color palettes on the site, and come up with something that works pretty well for you. You don't have to create a color palette from scratch. You can use color lovers to figure out what color palettes could work for your site rather than starting from scratch, because no one wants to start from scratch. That's ridiculous. So next up, fonts. Again, with the big overarching principles. Generally, good rule of thumb is to keep the number of fonts low per website. So probably like 2 fonts per website. And then use fancy or display fonts sparingly. And by that, I mean pretty much every font in the background of this. They're like cluttery fonts. And it's easier and better as a rule of thumb to work with cleaner fonts because that'll make your web designs or whatever you're designing look cleaner. And if you needed some more differentiation in your text, you can add italics and bolding and transforms, but generally 2 fonts per design is recommended. Again, though, let's work with some shortcuts. So instead of, say, going to Google Fonts and scrolling through like all, 200 Google fonts there are, trying to figure out what's the best thing for your project, there's a lot of sites out there like Beautiful Web Type and Typewolf that curate the top free Google fonts. And there's sites like this for Typekit and other font resources. And it's easier to go onto here and see what other people are saying are the best fonts and ones they recommend to use. So instead of being overwhelmed by choice by going to Google Fonts, you can go onto these sites and pick something out that works for you. So back to the widget. Now it's just 2 different fonts, a serif and a sans serif, which is another conversation. But essentially 2 different fonts. There's some differentiation in terms of, there's some italics. The download button's all caps now. The form is lowercase. But essentially, it's looking a little bit cleaner by having just 2 fonts as compared to what it was before. Last but not least, white space. White space is the ultimate clutter reducer. If you feel like you have a lot of clutter whenever you're designing, try adding some white space and see what happens. So for example, Hacker News. I always laugh when I see, every few months there's someone who says, I'd redesign Hacker News, and it goes on Hacker News, of course. And every single time they have a mock-up, and one of the biggest things that they do is they add more white space. Designers hate Hacker News and how cluttery it is. But for another example of white space, you can look at the New York Times redesign. And these are really similar to each other. The before is on the left and the after is on the right. And you might notice that the right is a little bit less cluttery. And one of the biggest things that they did was simply by added a little bit more white space in between the columns. And white space really is a huge trend right now. I went to one of those top website collection sites, and I took a random screenshot, and every one of them has this acres of white space. So it's a really big trend, which kind of helps you out if you're adding it to your site. You're kind of hearing the trends. But it's not just a trend, it's also can help your site perform better. So for example, in this test, this site added some more spacing in between their tables in terms of vertical spacing. And by doing this, they had a 20% improvement in engagement, 5% boost in products added to cart, and a 33% improvement in customers continuing on through purchase. So white space is not just a trend, it's not just going to look nicer, but it actually can impact the bottom line of whatever you're designing. So back to the little widget. Add a little bit more white space around the edges. We also normalize the white space in between the individual elements inside this little widget. There's more white space also added in between the individual lines of the content and the headline. So looking a little bit cleaner and a little bit easier on the eyes. So in terms of like just the visual parts of the website, the biggest thing that you can just focus on to make a really big improvement is simply to reduce visual clutter. And you can reduce visual clutter by keeping the number of fonts and colors low, by adding white space and lining things up. Essentially, by aiming for a clean design, you're going to do a lot of the work, like, it's going to take you so far. So, you know, visual design is great, but the main thing actually for design is actually user experiences, how the people are using whatever you're designing. And so whenever you're designing something, whether it's a widget, a website, a blog, homepage, landing page, try to think about what you want your customers, your users, the people visiting whatever you're designing to do, and make sure that action is easy to be seen and used. And that's why when you see widgets or home pages and whatnot, that's why the buttons for actions are usually brighter, easier to find, because it makes them like super clickable. I've seen a lot of banners like my website here, and that's why the button for buy the books, which is like definitely what I want people to do when they come to my website, that's why that's bright green. In the other websites, this website is fairly neutral and gray looking with a bright blue button. But it doesn't just have to be a homepage. This is the Wealthfront Engineering blog, and you can argue that they have this engineering blog so they can bring more people to their site and hopefully hire more engineers. And that's why the widget in the bottom right is bright green. It's like visible, easy to see, easy to click on. So really quickly in this section, it's important to pay attention to your goals and make them easy to find and use. I love analytics. Take a look at like how well things are performing. All right, now we're going to go back to clutter and talk a little bit about content, because I find a lot of people who are new to design, they build their website or whatnot, have a tendency to write way too much. People on the web don't read, they skim. And big paragraphs are intimidating and also a sign of clutter. So if you have a paragraph that you can't make smaller, make it more concise, it can help to break into bullets. For example, here, the left side, you can read it if you go line by line, but you can make it a little easier to read by breaking the important parts of that paragraph into bullets. And then you can make it even easier to read and skim by bolding the important parts of those paragraphs. We also talked about white space, and you can even make it even easier to read and skim by adding some white space. So someone coming here can scan, find the bolded parts, read those bolded parts and see if that's interesting to them, and they can read the rest of the paragraph if they want. But this is a lot easier to read than, say, a giant paragraph. And then moving on to headlines. Headlines also benefit from shortening down and making more concise. But also when it comes to headlines, it's better to talk about benefits rather than the details. I'll get to that in a second. And it's also really, really important to talk like a human, not a robot. There's so many people out there, I think, talk very dry and have very dry and direct headlines. But natural, friendly language is better for the readers and users of your website. For example, my website, this is technically what my books are about. They're an introduction to building web apps using Python and Django. But this is not enticing whatsoever. It's much better to have something like learn how to build a web app, because that's actually what someone coming to my website might want to do. And they can say, oh, that's indeed what I want to do. Thank you. And this isn't just like a personal thing. This actually also can help improve your conversion rates. So this article is how a simple headline change improved conversion by 52.8%. And essentially what they did is they turned their headlines from talking about the details of what their product did to the benefits it gives to the users. So we're back to the widget, and now you might say, like, oh, hey, that seems like a very long and wordy title, and the content is pretty long. And we can shorten that and make that a little easier to read and skim. So instead of that long headline, we turn it to something a little bit more natural, a little bit more human by saying learn how to make web apps. The content was shortened. We also have some bolding in that just to make it a little easier to skim. The form has a little more natural language than just saying email address. It says add your email here. And the button itself is a little bit more natural and friendly. Instead of just directly saying download, you can say, hey, send me free info. So talking about these principles, we've gone from here to here. So you can kind of see how everything ties together to help this little widget be better designed and easier to use. So a little bit about philosophy. One thing to really remember is that if you're, say, you have a project and you're going to design a website or a widget, whatnot, and you sit down, wipe everything off your desk, pull out a white piece of paper, turn off your cell phone, and then try to start designing or creating ideas from scratch, that's a lot like trying to program without the use of Google or Stack Overflow. This is not how it works. Trying to design from scratch without inspiration is like severely hindering yourself. Designers everywhere use inspiration. My books would not exist without the amazing A Book Apart books. I took a whole bunch of inspiration from these books. I did not steal anything, but I was heavily inspired by the great work that they did. So whenever you're designing, say you're building a website, go look for other designs, see what they're doing well, and try to be inspired and implement those ideas into whatever you're designing. There's a lot of sites out there that just collect great web design, like Site Inspire, Unmatched Style, CSS Mania. And when you see a site that you think is doing a great job, like say this really awesome Slack homepage, try to pick out what they're doing well. If you look at a website and you say, okay, this is what it's doing well, it's going to insert into your brain and kind of train your design eye so you can kind of regurgitate it up later. For example, you might look at this website design and say, hey, there's a lot of white space here. It makes it feel very open. The paragraph underneath the headline has some bolded parts, which helps with skimming, highlights the important parts of that paragraph. The form has a dark background, which catches the eye. The button has a green. It's much brighter. That also catches the eye. Free is bolded, which is always a good idea because that gets people excited. The headline has little squigglies under it, which is something you don't really see, so it's like immediately also eye-catching. So when you see a design that you like or your competitor's site, pick out what they're doing well, and that's going to help you train your design eye for later. So whenever you're working on design and say, working with your inspiration, you're working on website design, and you're thinking to yourself, oh my God, I'm a terrible designer. I want to share with you my process every single time that I design something. It's like this. Or not even maybe even yes. Sometimes it's like maybe. It's always horrible in the beginning, no matter what I'm doing. I'm like, I am a terrible designer. What has happened? Until the magical moment where I implement something and it comes together, or at least halfway comes together, or at least better than before. So if you are working on design and you're thinking to yourself, oh my gosh, I'm a terrible designer, nothing is working, you're not a bad designer. You're simply a designer. Welcome to the club. So this is only the starting point. I only had 20 minutes up here, and there's so much more I could say when it comes to design. Remember, if you're working on, to help your visual design, reduce your visual clutter. And you can reduce visual clutter by keeping the number of fonts and colors low, by adding white space, lining things up, and keeping your content short and easy to skim. Remember to look at your goals and see what you want someone to do when it comes to whatever you're designing, and make sure that that goal or that action is easy to find and use. Use that Google Analytics, track what's going on in your website or your widget or whatnot, and see if you can make changes that help improve your conversion rate. When you're working on content, resist the urge to overdo your content. Keep your content simple, friendly, and to the point. And practice, practice, practice. You're not going to become a good designer overnight, but by taking a small step and then taking another small step and taking another small step, the more you practice, the better at design you're going to be. You can't become an awesome developer overnight. Same thing with design. But I hope that you feel more confident in doing some design work on your own now. So this is going to be, hopefully someday, my third book that I write. And if you're interested in Hello Web Design, you can go to hellowebapp.com/web-design, and that is a dedicated list for when I, hopefully by the end of this year, finally release this book. Otherwise, I hope that this was entertaining and worked out well for all of you, and I hope that you're inspired to do some design yourself. Thank you.